Welcome to the Art of Medicine, the program that explores the arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Wilner. On this program, I love to speak with physicians who have made important contributions to medical practice and with physician authors. My guest today, Dr. Ola Saugstad, fits both of those categories. We're going to learn a lot in the next 30 minutes or so. But before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor, locumstory.com. Maybe you're curious about locums and how it might fit into your career story. But do you know all the different reasons physicians choose locums and how it works for them? At locumstory.com, you can hear firsthand stories as diverse as physicians themselves. There's not one solution for everyone. The variety of opportunities might surprise you. Locum Story is an unbiased educational resource. It has tools that let you explore trends in your specialty and compare different locums agencies. There's even a simple quiz to see if locums is right for you. Do your own research at locumstory.com. It's easy. And now, Dr. Ola Saugstad, welcome to the Art of Medicine.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. I just got your book the other day, Fighting for Air. I've put it in the library section on my website, www.andrewwilner.com. And of course, it's on Amazon. Do you happen to have a copy of it?
Yeah, it's here. I don't know if you can see it clearly.
Okay, so my understanding is that book took 74 years to write. Is that correct?
Well, not exactly, but I spent a couple of years writing it, yeah. But of course, as you are hinting at, I summarized my whole life, more or less, which was 74 years at that stage, yes.
Yeah, so bring us up to date. Tell us a little bit about what prompted you to, what's your background and what prompted you to write the book?
Yeah, well, I'm a pediatrician. I had my education in Oslo, Norway, and I went into neonatology because I was fascinated by that part of medicine very early, already actually when I was a medical student. And I started my PhD on a project on newborn hypoxia, birth asphyxia, lack of oxygen around birth. And I did that. I started actually in Sweden, Uppsala, Sweden. And then I finished my PhD in Oslo. This is way back to 77, sorry. So I became very devoted to neonatology, to take care of newborn babies. In 1991, when I was a consultant of neonatology at the National Hospital in Norway, based in Oslo, I was also appointed as a professor and director of the Department of Pediatric Research at the University of Oslo, which was and still is the largest research institute for children health in Norway. So I had that position for 27 years until I retired 5 years ago. So, but in between that, I did my postdoc in US. I was at the University of California, San Diego for 1 year. And also spent some time at the Cardiovascular Research Institute at the University of California, San Francisco. That's way back in the 1980s. So that's a little bit about my professional background.
Actually, in the early 1980s, I spent a couple months at UCSD in Southern California working on fish brains. And it's a beautiful campus and a lot of neurologists there. Yeah. Now, when you started neonatology, it was really a very new science. Is that correct?
Yeah, neonatology started more or less, let's say, around in the beginning of the 1960s. I mean, intensive care medicine of newborns. And actually, what kind of initiated that was the death of Patrick Kennedy in 1961. He was born preterm, and he died. And after that, intensive care medicine, ventilators for newborns were developed in the US, first of all. And then that spread to the rest of the world, to Europe. But in Norway, it started maybe 10 years later in the 70s. So yeah, it was quite a young branch of medicine when I started. So I met many of the old guys, and which were very important for the development of the field.
Now, just so we're all at the same starting point, why do newborns have such trouble breathing? Premature
Well,
newborns.
yeah, if the, there are approximately 5% of newborns in US and also in western part of the world needs help to start breathing immediately after birth. So they have apneas, or, the first breath is extremely important for these babies. They have to expand the lungs, and at the same time, the fluid which is filling the lungs is expelled. And so the baby takes the first breath and they start to cry, and the lungs are filled with air, so the gas exchange can start. But for approximately 5%, they need help with bag and mask ventilation. And in addition, there are several babies who need stimulation, just tactile stimulation to start breathing. So, but of course, most of the newborns, they have a very smooth transition. But for those 5%, and 5% is quite a lot, when you know that there are 4 million newborns in US, 135 million newborns globally every year. So there are many millions of newborns who need help to start breathing.
Okay, so I guess way back when, the obvious thing to do was to give them 100% oxygen. I mean, that would be the obvious thing to do. But you had this idea that maybe that's not the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's correct. Oxygen was described and discovered as an element in the late 1700s, 1774, by Priestley in England. And oxygen was then very quickly, within a few years, was given as treatment to newborns. And it continued like that. And so it was standard care to give 100% oxygen for newborns who did not breathe immediately after birth. So they were ventilated with 100% oxygen. And I started to think about this, and that this might not be the optimal way to treat these babies. And the reason I started to think about that was that my PhD thesis was about hypoxia in newborns, but it was also an experimental study. And I had detected that by chemical substance, a metabolite, which is named hypoxanthine, when it reacts with oxygen, free radicals are generated. And I was able to show that very high concentrations of hypoxanthine accumulates in newborn babies who lack oxygen. So then I started to think that maybe the combination of high level of hypoxanthine and oxygen might be detrimental. And now we are back to the end of the 1970s, and I introduced this idea first time in a paper in 1980. So that's way back. It's more than 40 years ago.
Well, all right, let's jump ahead 40 years. What do we do now? Do we give them 100% oxygen, or does it turn out that's not the way to go?
Yeah, well, you know, when I introduced this idea, many people just laughed and thought that I was crazy or stupid, because, you know, it was standard of care to give 100% oxygen. So I started with some experiments with newborn animals, and we were able to show that it is possible to resuscitate with air, the air around us, which contains 21% oxygen, just as efficiently as with 100% oxygen. And then we moved on and did a pilot study with a colleague in India, in Delhi. His name is Siddharth Ramji, and he was very brave because he was willing to do such a study, and very quickly we were able to show that it is possible to resuscitate with air. And then we did a multi-center study, a randomized multi-center study in several countries, and we showed that it's possible. And actually, there was a strong tendency to a lower mortality in those babies who had been resuscitated with air. And that was, even to me, it was a surprise, because I thought, okay, maybe it is as efficient, but I hadn't expected that mortality would be lower. And then other investigators did similar studies, clinical studies, and very soon it was clear that by substituting 100% oxygen with air, mortality is reduced 30%. And that was highly significant. And that is quite dramatic results. So, so now we are in the beginning of the 2000s. So from 2006, there was a gradual change in attitudes in different countries. And 2010, the International Committee for Newborn Resuscitation, which is named ILCOR, they changed their guidelines from 100% oxygen to room air. And that was a dramatic change. And so the last 12 years, it has been our common practice to resuscitate newborn babies with air instead of 100% oxygen. And this is a big advantage, not only because mortality is decreased. By the way, we estimated that a 30% reduction in mortality means that we can save 200,000 to 300,000 newborn babies worldwide every year by just substituting oxygen with air. But there's another important factor, and that was the so-called stillbirth, so-called fresh stillbirths. Babies who didn't breathe, maybe didn't have any heart rate when they were born. And in low-income countries, these babies were not even tried to be resuscitated. They were just put aside and died. And that is still, there's more than 1 million babies every year. And a study from Wally Carlo in Birmingham, in Alabama, showed that 30% of these can be rescued by bag and mask ventilation. So that adds another 300,000 saved lives, totally approximately 500,000 lives globally every year, just by changing from oxygen to air.
Well, and I guess pragmatically, not everybody, you know, globally has a bottle of 100% oxygen next to the bed, but everybody has a bottle of air, right? So
yeah, exactly. The air is everywhere, and oxygen is actually expensive, and So in low-income countries, most places they didn't have oxygen, and and the attitude was that if you don't have oxygen, there's no reason to even try to ventilate, to try to resuscitate these babies. So they were just let aside and nobody cared about them. So that was a big advantage.
Well, there are a lot of children out there who owe you a thank you.
Yeah,
They don't
yeah.
they don't know that it's you, but that
Mm.
must be a very nice feeling.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is.
You know, your story, when I was reading your book, it reminds me of the story, I'm sure you're familiar with this, of stomach ulcers, where
Yeah, yeah,
for many, many years,
yeah,
everybody knew that stomach ulcers were due to stress and you needed to
yeah,
see a psychiatrist. And
yeah,
then these two crazy guys, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, said, oh, no,
mm,
no, it's due to this new bacterium,
yeah,
Helicobacter
mm,
pylori, and we can
yeah,
treat it with antibiotics. And they just
yeah,
thought these guys were lunatics, right?
yeah, yeah.
And, and they were
And they
right.
got and they got the Nobel Prize for that.
You know,
So yeah,
so sometimes you have to stick to your guns. I think that's the lesson of your story and theirs. Good for you.
yeah. But many people were skeptical, and some people were actually angry and aggressive, thought that this was child abuse and so forth. So then I always, if I got such accusations, I said, how do you know that oxygen is the best? Because it had never been tested out in any randomized trials before.
I want to write a book about all the things you knew were true but aren't.
Yeah, yeah,
and and I think
mm,
that's one of them.
yeah,
So let me explore a little bit. You mentioned there was a lot of disbelief. There were even accusations. I was very uncomfortable, your position. How did you personally cope with that? What enabled you, do you think, to stick to your guns and push through with this?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I had the attitude that it was my task, my calling to test this out, but it was not my duty to give new recommendations. I left that to others. So I just presented results from animal studies and from 2 clinical studies, first of all. And I left it to others to decide whether the guidelines should change and in what way they should change. So I think that was very important. I kept out of that. So I felt I handled this in a decent way. I mean, I followed all the ethical rules for medical research. So I felt I was on the right track.
You mentioned in your book, I think it was when you were a teenager, that you discovered or rediscovered your faith.
Yeah,
Um, was that important in this process?
yeah. I think Christian faith is important as a support and also as a kind of correction that you are going the right direction. I didn't grow up in a particularly Christian home, but as I also write about in my book, my parents divorced when I was 13 years old, and I think that was important for me to find, I mean, another kind of solid base for my life. So I started to go into church and became a churchgoer. Yes, and that's been very important part of my life, and still is, of course.
And it still is. And it still
Yeah,
is. Because I can imagine when everybody's telling you that this is a nutty theory and you're wasting their time, right? And you're abusing these children, Did you have any self-doubt, or were you sure you were doing the right thing?
Well, of course, I questioned myself if I was on the right track, but I think we did this very carefully. For instance, the first clinical studies, we decided that if a baby didn't respond to resuscitation with air, within 90 seconds, we switched them over to oxygen, so that we knew that we didn't do any harm. So I think we were very careful with the first in the first studies. But of course, it would have been terrible, let's say, and I've been thinking about that many times. Although we today know that air is better than oxygen for these babies, there might be subgroups of babies who would need oxygen, and it's difficult to kind of discover that. So you need huge studies to do that. For instance, preterm babies, the most preterm babies, they shouldn't be resuscitated with air. They should be resuscitated with some supplemental oxygen, and for instance, 30% oxygen. And we're still working on this field because we don't know what is the optimal for babies born, for instance, more than 8 weeks premature, especially those who are born more than 12 weeks before term. We don't know the optimal initial oxygen concentration to give these babies. So we have a large international group which is now testing this out in different studies around the world, in Australia, North America, and also in Europe. So there's still unanswered questions. And in addition, I think every scientist has to realize that what we believe is right may be wrong tomorrow. So I think it's important that we search ourselves and see that, is there anything wrong with the way I was thinking, and I still do that.
Well, you made just a terrific contribution, and I highly recommend your book. I think it's a great story to read, and I think many scientists have self-doubt and should, but should also not abandon their good ideas.
Yeah, no, it's important to find the right balance between the doubt and belief. And
Professor Ola, what is next for you? What are you going to do now? How about tomorrow?
Well, I'm still active, although I'm emeritus as a professor, and I'm not the director of the research institute. I still have some students, and I have a position at Northwestern University in Chicago as an adjunct professor, and so I hope that I'm able to go there this spring, because due to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, I haven't been there for several years now. So I look forward to resume that activity. And I'm also editor of a medical journal. And so I'm busy, and I'm traveling around the world, also giving lectures about resuscitation of newborns and how to oxygenate newborn babies in an optimal way. So yeah, it keeps me busy.
At my hospital where I work here in Memphis, we do have a regional high-risk pregnancy center. So this is something that we do see. So that's just terrific. Well, is there anything you'd like to add before we close?
No, I think well, thank you for inviting me to this podcast, and well, I think we have covered many aspects. There was one thing I didn't mention, which was very important in my life, and that was I spent 2 years in Chicago when I was a small boy, from the age of 3 to 5, because my father, who was a psychologist, he did his PhD in Chicago. So I spent totally, I think, 4 years of my life in US.
Well, Dr. Saugstad, I want to thank you very much for chatting with me on the art of medicine.
Thank you so much.
Well, before we close, I'd like to give another thanks to our sponsor, locumstory.com, a resource where providers can get real, unbiased answers about locum tenens. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner. See you next time. This program is hosted, edited, and produced by Andrew Wilner, MD, FACP, FAAN. Guests receive no financial compensation for their appearance on the art of medicine. Andrew Wilner, MD, is Associate Professor of Neurology at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, Memphis, Tennessee. Views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this program belong solely to Dr. Wilner and his guests and not necessarily to their employers, organizations, or other group or individual. While this program intends to be informative, it is meant for entertainment purposes only. The art of medicine does not offer professional financial, legal, or medical advice. Dr. Wilner and his guests assume no responsibility or liability for any damages, financial or otherwise, that arise in connection with consuming this program's content. Thanks for watching. For more episodes of The Art of Medicine, please subscribe. www.andrewwilner.com